Sato and Akane have been at each other's throats for as long as they've known each other. And on this particular day, Akane is yelling at him for some reason. But Sato couldn't care less and tells her to leave him alone. But that just leads to an even bigger argument. One of Akane's friends, Hinamari, comes over and she finds it funny how they are always fighting. But now that she thinks about it, Akane seems to care way too much about what Sato does. So she's starting to wonder if there's something going on between the two of them. Akane is disgusted and denies having any feelings for Sato because she'd much rather have a roach crawl into your ear and go out with him. And Sato is equally offended by the idea of dating someone like her, so they start arguing some more. Once the school day is over, Sato is on his way back home, but all of a sudden, he gets a phone call from his grandpa. He answers and his grandpa invites him to come have some tea with him at his house. But Sato has better things to do, so he's not interested in going on a tea date with his grandpa. Grandpa reminds him that he already made Sato the heir to his company, so the least he could do is spend some time with his dear old Pop while he's still alive. But even if Sato still doesn't want to, Grandpa knows a thing or two about kidnapping children, so he has a limo and some of his armed guards pull up beside Sato. Sato briefly considers running out of there like a track star, but then he realizes his grandpa is definitely crazy enough to have him shot and sent to the hospital, so he decides to comply. He gets in the limo, and while the guards are driving him, he asks where he is being taken. The guards are apologetic because they know their boss is being unreasonable, so he tells him that they were instructed to bring Sato to a villa, but they don't know what Sato's grandpa is planning. Sato's grandpa, Tenryu Hojo, once saved the Hojo Group from the brink of collapse. And under his leadership, the Hojo Group became a global high-tech corporation. So it isn't a stretch to say that he's one of the richest and most powerful people in the world. And it may be hard to believe, but Sato's grandpa cares about his grandson more than anything. But Sato's father, on the other hand, seems to care a lot more about milk. Eventually, they arrive at the house, so Sato sits outside and waits for his grandpa to show up. But while he's waiting, Akane unexpectedly shows up, and the first thing she does is yell at him. She asks Sato what he's doing here, so he explains that his grandpa asked him to come. And as it turns out, Akane's grandma invited her here for tea as well. The situation is strange, and neither of them knows what's going on, but they still can't stand each other, so they end up bickering as usual. Just then, Sato's grandpa and Akane's grandma show up, and they've got something important to tell the two kids, so everyone heads inside. A feast has been prepared because the two grandparents want to celebrate, but Sato has no idea what they are supposedly celebrating here. He also notices that Akane hasn't touched her food at all, so he asks if she's alright. But his concern is met with a roast because Akane says his ugly face made her lose her appetite. The two start arguing again, and both grandparents find it very amusing since it reminds them of how they used to act when they were back in high school. Sato is getting sick of this, so he asks them what they want to talk about, and the two respond saying that Sato and Akane are going to get married. Sato and Akane are in disbelief and think they must have misheard their grandparents because there's no way they just told the two of them to get married, especially since they are still in high school. But their grandparents are dead serious about it. Tenryu and Chiyo have known each other since they were kids and were even in love back then, but due to some petty arguments, they ended up drifting apart. Tenryu and Chiyo both ended up marrying other people, but after a lifetime apart, both of their partners are 6 feet under, so the two decided to reconnect. The point is, even though they are happy with their lives now, they can't help but wonder what could have been had they stayed together as a couple when they were kids, and what better way to relive their youth than to drive their grandkids into it and force the two of them to get married. Akane objects to the marriage because marriage is something that's supposed to be done out of love, not because two old people want to watch their grandkids getting frisky. Plus, Sato points out that it's literally illegal to force kids into marriage, and there's nothing Tenryu or Chiyo can do to make them agree to the marriage. Tenryu had expected that response, which is why he came prepared with some legal blackmail. He signals for the door to be opened and gives Sato an ultimatum. Either he marries Akane or the dog dies. Sato doesn't really care because that's not his dog. But then Tenryu threatens to write Sato out of his will and renounce him as his heir. That's something Sato doesn't care about, so he's starting to think that marrying Akane might not be so bad. But Akane is still strictly opposed because if she's going to get married, and she only wants to do it with someone she loves. Just then, Chiyo calls Akane over, and whatever she said must have been a serious threat because it sends shivers down Akane's spine. Now that all the blackmail has been laid out, Tenryu says he is giving the two of them 3 days to decide whether they'll get married to each other or not. Once their grandparents are gone, Akane asks Sato what they are going to do, but neither of them has made a decision. But he needs to have all the details first, so he asks Akane what threat her grandma made so he knows how bad her situation is. Akane gets defensive and refuses to tell him since it's a private matter. Later that night, Akane is laying in bed and thinking about how she has never managed to outperform Sato. And what pisses her off even more is the fact that he always beats her without even trying. She decides to call Himari to ask for advice on what she should do. And after explaining the situation of being forced to marry someone she doesn't like, hypothetically of course, Himari is surprised that stuff like that still happens. Akane asks what Himari would do if she were in the same situation. So Himari tells her that she would have to refuse since she has someone she already likes, and she would never marry someone else. Akane is surprised to hear that Himari has a crush since she has never mentioned him before, but that's just because Akane never asked. Akane asks for the details, but Himari doesn't want to tell her the guy's name for now since she still hasn't confessed to him yet, although she doesn't admit that it's someone from their class. They talk about Himari's love life enough for one night, so Himari changes the subject and asks Akane if she is in love with anyone. Akane has never had time to fall in love with someone before and right now, and the only emotion Akane is feeling is a burning hatred for a certain someone. Since Akane doesn't have a crush or anything, Himari thinks it would be fine if she just got married like her grandparents want. After all, assuming this hypothetical guy isn't a serial killer, they could just live together in split rent and bills, so it would be a great way for Akane to save on living expenses. Although she'd probably need to give birth to an heir at some point, and Akane doesn't think she could handle that. Meanwhile, back at his house, Sato is having a panic attack because he already has a hard enough time dealing with Akane at school. But if they end up married, then he will never be able to escape her constant nagging. Sato's cousin, Shize, can tell that something is bothering him, so she asks him what's wrong and Sato explains that their grandpa is threatening to disown him if he doesn't agree to his demands. That definitely sounds like something their grandpa would do, so Shize asks Sato what he plans to do. She's perfectly fine with him giving up his rights to the company if that's what he wants, because even if he ends up becoming a hobo, she will still love him the same. However, she knows that Sato has big dreams, and if he is going to accomplish those, then he will need access to the Hojo Group's resources. Regardless of what he chooses to do, Shize promises that she will be by his side to help him every step of the way, and Sato is really glad to have her with him. 3 days go by and both Sato and Akane meet with their grandparents because they have made their decisions and are going to get married. Since that has been settled, Sato says he and Akane will file the paperwork for their marriage once they've graduated. But that's not good enough for their grandparents because they expect Sato and Akane to be in their life as a married couple immediately. They've even got a brand new house lined up for them, so they drop them off there and drive off. Akane starts freaking out because she can't just suddenly start living with Sato. But Sato is already desensitized to the BS his grandpa pulls, so this doesn't surprise him. The two of them head inside, and if nothing else, this house is actually pretty nice, so Akane thinks living here might actually be fun. Or it would be if she didn't have to stay here with Sato. This place is fully equipped with everything they could possibly need, but there's just one problem. There's only one bed. They call their grandparents to complain about the bed, but they intentionally set it up that way because they want Sato and Akane to sleep together. Sato realizes that their grandparents must have set up cameras in order to watch them at night, which is most definitely illegal, but he can't figure out where they put them. However, while Sato is worrying about the cameras, Akane is worrying about having to sleep in the same bed as him. For now, they still need to get their stuff unpacked, so Akane is carrying her stuff upstairs, but that box looks pretty heavy, so Sato asks if she needs any help. She's perfectly capable of doing it by herself. If she doesn't want his help, Sato isn't going to force the issue. But after taking a few steps, Akane loses her footing and falls backwards. Thankfully, she wasn't falling with an umbrella, so Sato catches her and she's perfectly safe. But he asks that she be a little more careful because if she ends up getting herself killed, he'd become the prime murder suspect. After everything has been unpacked, Sato finds a meal his grandpa left for him to eat. After warming up the pizza, Sato is about to start eating, but Akane smells the food and she's really hungry, like she's too stubborn to ask for a piece. Sato doesn't want her to starve, so he ends up giving her a slice. A few minutes later, Sato is ready for bed, so he heads into the bedroom and lays down to go to sleep. But then Akane comes in, and he remembers that they have to share the bed. They both agree that they weren't going to do anything, but there's no way Sato can fall asleep like this. To distract himself, he starts a conversation and asks Akane why she agreed to this marriage, but she still doesn't want to give any details about her reasons. This marriage is just a formality, so she's just going to have to put up with it for the sake of her dream, even if it means following their grandparents' weird rules. Sato suddenly realizes that if their grandparents can arbitrarily make up rules whatever they want, then it's only a matter of time before they make a rule about the two of them having kids. That brings us back to the present, where Akane reminds Sato that under no circumstances is he allowed to tell anyone that they are married. No matter what, Sato tells her that he already intends to keep it a secret. But Akane still doesn't trust him because what guy wouldn't want to brag about getting married to her? The next day at school, Sato's cousin, Shize, quickly pieces together that he has given in to Tenryu's demand by marrying Akane. Disapproving of the arrangement, she demands a bribe to keep quiet. Sato, already overwhelmed, reluctantly complies, knowing that the last thing he needs is more chaos. Meanwhile, Akane is horrified by Sato's diet of nothing but instant ramen, protein shakes, and vitamin supplements. Appalled by his lack of nutrition, she insists on cooking a proper meal for him. However, the taste of real food stirs up painful memories his parents neglect, where meals were an afterthought, and the extravagant business dinners hosted by Tenryu. Overwhelmed by emotions he thought he had buried, Sato pushes the plate away, leading to yet another argument. Their fights escalate over the most trivial things: how to cook, how to clean, how to study, even how to game. Every conversation turns into a battle of wills, leaving both exhausted and frustrated. Desperate for a solution to their constant clashes, she confides in her friend Himari, who advises that they need to start respecting and listening to each other. Similarly, Shize tells Sato that compromise is key to survival. Though skeptical, both Sato and Akane decide to give it a shot. Acknowledging that divorce isn't an option, they sit down for an honest discussion, setting ground rules for sharing chores and coexisting under one roof. To their surprise, they manage to go an entire day without fighting, a small victory that feels monumental. That night, as Sato watches Akane laugh over something trivial, he feels his heart race. He refuses to acknowledge it, but deep down, he knows she really is beautiful. And maybe, just maybe, they don't hate each other as much as they thought. One night, Sato is busy reading his favorite book when Akane interrupts him. She tells him she rented a movie that caught her attention. Sato assumes she wants him to move, so he starts to get up, but Akane stops him. Confused, he stares at her, unsure of what she wants. She holds up the movie tape, 24 uncut hours of kitten footage. She says she wants them to watch it together. Sato is baffled and considers this to be utter bullshit, wondering why anyone would want to watch kittens for 24 hours straight. Fortunately, Akane finds the 3-hour version of the movie instead, and Sato quickly suggests they watch that version instead. They begin watching the movie, and while Akane enjoys every second of it, Sato dozes off on the couch, bored out of his mind. When the movie ends, Akane expresses how much she loved it and suggests they watch the full 24-hour version next time. Sato suddenly wakes up from his nap, disoriented and muttering something about an alien planet. Since they watched something Akane likes, she insists it's only fair for Sato to pick the next thing to watch. However, Sato admits he prefers games to movies. Unfortunately, Akane doesn't know how to play games. Determined, Sato holds his controller up and vows to teach her, hoping she might even enjoy gaming as much as he does. 30 minutes later, Akane is having the time of her life, celebrating her victory after defeating a game boss. And Sato watches her with a faint smile, surprised at how much fun he's having with his so-called arch-nemesis. Later that night, as they lie in bed, Sato wakes up and notices Akane isn't covered by the blanket. He adjusts it. To his surprise, Akane is already awake. She thanks him for the fun they had that day. Facing opposite directions in bed, Sato tells her she can pick the next game they buy, and he'll pick the next movie they watch. At school, Akane helps Sato pick up an eraser he dropped. As Sato lifts his head from his desk, he thanks her and Akane blushes lightly in response. Himari walks up to Akane moments later and asks if she and Sato had a fight, not wanting anyone to know she's getting along with Sato. Akane insists they're always fighting. However, Himari senses something is off. Their behavior doesn't match their usual constant bickering. Feeling cornered, Akane rushes out of the classroom and goes home. A few hours later, Sato is in the library searching for a book when Chizé sneaks up behind him. She covers his eyes with her hands and playfully asks him to guess who it is. Knowing Chizé is the only person who would pull such a stunt, Sato correctly guesses it's her. She laughs and removes her hands from his eyes, confirming his guess. Chizé notices Sato holding a book on communication skills, and although she knows that his communication skills are dog water, she still asks him what it's for. Sato explains that he thinks it might help him strengthen his relationship with Akane. During the break, Sato calls out to Akane as she walks down the hall. Akane turns around with an annoyed look, saying she prefers not to talk much at school. Sato asks if she's busy or has plans for later in the day. When he learns she's free, he invites her to go shopping with him after school. Akane realizes this might be a date, but before she can overreact, Sato quickly pulls her into an empty room to avoid being overheard. Inside the room, Akane scolds him for dragging her into such a dark space because she thinks he's trying to get some. But Sato isn't trying to catch a case, so he clarifies that he only did it because she was about to say something about a date. Akane blushes slightly and points out that it's basically a date since guys and girls don't just meet up for no reason. Sato tries to brush it off, saying it's not a date and that he only needs her help to carry groceries. Akane finds this amusing and decides to play along, leading them both to laugh like total goofballs. After school, Akane is startled when Himari greets her excitedly. Himari's shift at work got cancelled and she wants to hang out. However, Akane already has plans with Sato and doesn't know how to tell her. Himari enthusiastically talks about all the fun they could have together, but Akane, with tears in her eyes, admits she already has plans with someone. Himari takes no offense and, curious, asks if it's a new friend. When Akane says it's someone Himari knows, Himari quickly guesses it's Sato and teasingly asks if it's a date. Flustered, Akane speeds off to avoid answering any more questions. Later, Akane and Sato walk through the park, both blushing as they approach the supermarket near their homes. Inside, Sato notices they're out of eggs at home and a pack to place in the cart. Akane stops him, pointing out that he should check the price before just adding things to the cart. A few minutes later, Akane discovers the supermarket is holding a limited time sale and a crowd has already gathered to grab the discounted items. She tries to push her way through the chaos, but quickly gets shoved to the side. Sato attempts to jump in as well, but he's tossed aside even faster than Akane. Left lying on the floor in shame, they both burst into laughter at how terrible they were fighting for the sale. Akane stands up, smiling, and declares that she isn't going to give up. And then after that, the two walk home together. That night, Akane wakes up to find Sato with his finger in front of her face, about to poke her cheek. She sits up and immediately scolds him, accusing him of planning something as gruesome as gouging a hole in her cheek. Sato denies her accusation and decides to admit he's a total simp by explaining that he couldn't resist poking her cheek because she looked so cute while sleeping. Akane blushes at his response and hugs her pillow. She lies back down and tells him he can watch her sleep, but only for a little while, which is still very creepy. The next morning, they both wake up and greet each other with awkward blushes. Later that afternoon, on their way to school, they pass by a stall selling strawberry cream buns. Akane wants one, so Sato goes to buy it for her. He returns with the pastry in hand, but it's too large for her to eat alone. He suggests they split it, and as they share the cream bun, Himari spots them. She's surprised because she's never seen them together outside school, and begins to suspect something is going on between them. Akane quickly denies it, claiming Sato was just stalking her. That night, Akane stays up late studying for an upcoming test. Sato, on the other hand, doesn't see the point in studying. He boasts that he never studies and just memorizes everything from class, even scoring perfectly on the last test. Akane takes this as mockery, throws her pillow at him, and tells him to leave. A few minutes later, Sato knocks on her door and hands her a snack. She takes it inside, wondering why he would go out of his way to make it for her. She decides to take one bite and is overwhelmed by how delicious it is. The next morning at school, Akane is walking through the halls when she suddenly collapses. Luckily, Himari is nearby and rushes to her side. Himari asks if she's okay and Akane reassures her that she's fine, just a bit sleep-deprived from studying all night. Himari urges her not to push herself too hard and reminds her that her health is more important. But Akane is more focused on getting the top grade in the class. Himari advises her again, pointing out that she'll never outscore Sato. Despite this, Akane remains determined to surpass Sato in every way. That evening, Sato brings her a late-night snack, only to find her slumped over her desk. Assuming she's fallen asleep, he moves closer, but notices her uncomfortable expression. He quickly realizes she isn't feeling well. Sato checks Akane's temperature and sees that it's a worrying 40 degrees. She's clearly burning up from a fever. As he tends to her, Akane mumbles weakly, talking about how much she needs to study if she ever wants to achieve her dream of becoming a doctor. She explains that her ultimate goal is to help people live long, healthy lives and to be someone who can step in whenever someone is in need. Akane's voice turns quieter as she shares how her parents can't afford to send her to medical school. She reveals that the only reason she agreed to marry Sato in the first place was because her grandmother promised to fund her education if she married him. Hearing this, Sato feels a mix of surprise and admiration. He never knew about this deeply personal dream of hers. A few minutes later, Sato checks her temperature again. This time it's climbed to 42 degrees. Alarmed, he decides it's time to call an ambulance, but Akane insists there's no need for that and tells him to just go to bed. He tries calling an ambulance anyway, but can't get through. Seeing no other option, he picks her up in his arms and tells her he won't just stand by while she's suffering. As he carries her outside, Akane looks at him with surprise. She never thought he had the strength to lift her so easily. She jokes about him being stronger than she thought he was. That aside, Sato decides to use this precious moment to bring up the dream she mentioned earlier. At first, she assumes he's about to roast her about it, but instead he tells her that he believes in her. He's confident she'll achieve her dream because she's someone who never gives up no matter how hard things get. The scene shifts to the following morning. Akane wakes Sato up by leaning over him with a playful smirk and a mock death threat. She quickly laughs it off, saying he should be grateful she woke him up in time for school. It turns out Akane only had a bad cold that day, and a week later, everything has returned to normal. At school, Sato's day starts with Himari approaching him to congratulate him on his perfect test score. Not long after, Akane walks up to him with a deadly serious look in her eyes. She reminds him that he has a wife and warns him not to get too close to other girls.